So this is a video response to the Gravel Institute on their video about the American Civil War. A professor of history named Professor Matt Garb is arguing that the American Civil War was a Marxist class-style struggle to overthrow the capitalists and create a workers' utopia. So the reason why this narrative is extremely false, is several fold. Um, Not to mention the mere fact that capitalism and slavery are diametrically opposed to one another, and the arrival of modern capitalism ushered in the final death nail to the horrendous institution of slavery, but also the political leaders and the advocates who sought to end slavery were supporters of the market economy and were patriots and opposed socialism in all of its forms. So Lincoln himself, who was not a Marxist, despite what some people on the left would have you believe, was not a Marxist. He was a prosperous corporate lawyer, represented one of the largest railroad firms in all of Illinois. He was a wealthy lawyer for most of his life, and he was a strong proponent of the Whig economic program, which called for industrialization of America and an end to the Jeffersonian agrarian utopia, which has been copied in socialist countries to an extent, like in Pol Pot's Cambodia. Anyway, one of the arguments that Professor Karp makes is that the South, the South's cotton production accounted for most of its economy. And this is a argument that's made by other institutions like the 1619 Project, which overestimates just how much cotton production was mattered to the world economy. Truth of the matter is that as far as total GDP goes for the South, cotton production accounted for about 5 to 10%. So it was a bit, but not nearly enough to say that it was that important to the Southern economy. The South had other industries that were beginning to progress on the eve of the Civil War, things like railroads and shipping and other industries. And the British economy and the French economy, while yes, still very much so dependent upon cotton, were beginning to move away from American cotton anyhow, and we're starting to stock up more and bring in more cotton from Egypt, and from India. In fact, the ultimate Ottoman Sultan was a strong supporter of the Union side for that reason. So and it's one of the reasons why most historians do not make great economists or accountants, because one of the arguments made by the 1619 Project as well is that double entry bookkeeping was a legacy of slavery. Again, double entry bookkeeping is a practice that goes back well before America was even discovered, more or less when slavery started in this continent. Now, on to the issue of who were the abolitionists. Who were the abolitionists? Well, the abolitionists were lots of people. And they were not socialist. They were mostly religious people, religious class people who fought for the emancipation of blacks. And they were supporters of various reform movements in the West. Most abolitionists, as well as being opponents of slavery, were in favor of temperance. They were in favor of animal rights, like in Britain. This is similar to what was happening in Britain during the Victorian era, when you saw a revival of religious fervor and of reformism, the rise of the nonconformists in Britain, or the Baptist and the evangelical movement here. So it was not a Marxist and therefore atheistic ideology that they were pushing for here. Most didn't even really consider economics when in their struggle against slavery. Frederick Douglass didn't mention it. Andrew Lloyd, the great abolitionist of Boston, Andrew Lloyd Garrison, didn't mention it. They were arguing from a moral standpoint, which is a superior standpoint. Now, the issue of slavery and capitalism is something that a lot of historians are making these days, and it's something that's being increasingly encroached upon in schools, saying that the two are somehow related to each other. Nothing can be further from the truth. You see, in the rise of the industrial era, especially in the United States, all the major industrialists were vehemently abolitionist. And you see this again and again. You see people like John D. Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie, and John Hopkins advocating for the abolition of slavery, ardent Republicans. There was a great book written several years ago, I think I might have it still, about how Washington, D.C. was almost overrun by the Confederate Army during the Civil War. And it mentions how Andrew Carnegie played a pivotal role in making sure that did not happen. He organized railroad depots and brought supplies to and from the front, helped soldiers get to the front, and brought them back when they were injured. He played a pivotal role in making sure the Confederacy didn't end up in that Washington, D.C. didn't end up in Confederate hands. Same thing with John D. Rockefeller, a lifelong Republican, lifelong supporter of Abraham Lincoln, and a lifelong abolitionist. Yes, indeed, because of his religious beliefs, he was an ardent Baptist, but more importantly, he did not see slavery as an institution compatible with the rise of the market, because slavery was already in the decline as an economic institution anyway in the South. It had remained only as a generational phenomenon. But this sending in and out of slaves to and from Africa had been abolished already. So the institution was already on the decline, which is not to say that it would have worked better if it would have been abolished gradually. The sooner the better, absolutely, for something like slavery. And that's why it should be continued to be fought, which there still is slavery all across the world. And supporters of liberal democracy, of market capitalism, should be taking a more vested interest in it, in my personal opinion, because that's how they're going to end up saving capitalism in the long run and helping its PR, which is an definite need right now. So Tarp also mentions something that Lincoln said in his 1862 address to Congress, saying that labor was superior to capital. And yes, he did say that. That being said, you know what Lincoln also said? He said that you cannot punish the weak by weakening. You cannot strengthen the weak by weakening the strong. And you cannot help the poor by taking away from the rich. And you cannot help man permanently with doing what they could and should do themselves. That, to me, is a much more profound statement on what his political philosophy was. For a long time now, and this is something that has been going back to when Obama was first president, saying that he was somehow the inheritor of Lincoln's legacy, that he was going to promote Lincoln's that he was somehow a promoter of Lincoln's legacy, and that he was a promoter of his ideology, if you want to call it that. Obama doesn't have a leg to stand on when it comes to Lincoln. Never did. This was a self-aggrandizement scheme that liberals tried to make about Obama, trying to make themselves feel good, and also in a very smug way, trying to say that all opponents of Obama, anyone who questioned him, was somehow would be in favor of slavery, which to me is just an egregious attack, has no basis in reality, has no basis in history, and is very insulting to most people. So, to conclude, I hope you've learned today just how to save America from the educational and historical bankruptcy that's now infesting our schools, and how we need to make a measured response to these shoehornings in of Marxist ideology into American history that simply isn't there, and that people try to make up on the spot because, again, like socialists try to do, create these grand romanticized narratives about socialism. So it takes people like me and others who are unapologetically civic nationalist, civic who promote civic virtue, to restore the education system and to make sure that those who want to paint American history in a way that isn't in line with facts and reality should be checked and should be corrected. So thank you again. My name is American Bonapartist.